audience, or we think that this feature is going to be particularly important. But I'm also really interested in assumptions that a user makes while they're moving through a website or an app. And we can categorize these essentially as guesses. So I think I'm going to be able to find this in this section. Or I think this button will take me here. And so users are always taking some kind of leap of faith when they're using the interface. They're making a best guess. And what can we do to make sure that they're right more often? No problem. I've been thinking about assumptions more and more because it's really exciting and sort of discouraging when I talk to a client and they're super psyched and they're like, yeah, totally, we know about design, we know about research, and we want the interface simple and intuitive. And 100% our job as UX designers is to make something that's intuitive and simple and works the way that you think it will. But who your target audience is, who your user is, has so much to do with what makes something intuitive. So if our job is to make something that works well and simply, are there repeatable ways that we can do this as often as possible? We have multiple target audiences across many projects. Is there a realistic and sustainable approach that we can take that hopefully will end up in a simple and intuitive interface? Another really interesting thing about design is that, as a rule, designers are not going to be with their target audience when they come to the site. I can't sit next to you and find out what you want to do and lead you through the site. When you get there, you're going to have to figure it out for yourself. And the extent to which you're able to do that is going to determine the quality of your user experience. So then my question is, what magic can designers perform that's going to make this much easier? And what does all of that have to do with assumptions? So there's this quote that I really like. It's called, by Douglas Copeland, and he coined the term Generation X in a dystopian novel. But he said, our curse is that we are forced to interpret life as a sequence of events, a story. And that when we can't figure out what our particular story is, we feel lost somehow. And I know that admittedly, storytelling can seem like a bit of a cliche in this industry. We have brand story and storytellers. But I am really interested in these areas in which there are sort of predictable patterns and assumptions. And one area that this exists is music. And this is a quote from a musician who was very influential to me growing up. I don't know if you recognize it. He's being interviewed about a project that he's working on. He says it's part of a trilogy, a musical trilogy I'm working on in D minor, which is the saddest of all keys, I find. People weep instantly when they hear it, and I don't know why. This quote is, of course, from Nigel Tufnell. This is Spinal Tap. But I was always really curious why you could say something like that, why you could quantify D minor as the saddest of all keys. I was also really curious how they got that amp to go up to 11. But that's a question for another time. There's a better source, I think, than Nigel Tufnell when it comes to music, and his name is David Levington, and he wrote a book called This Is Your Brain on Music. And he was able to find that when we experience music, we're constantly making guesses and assumptions as to how the sound is going to travel. And we're compelled or obsessed with finding the pattern that's inherent to music. And when it alters, there's this tension that's created, and that tension has a lot to do with how we experience music. And I think it's so cool. Like, if I were to poll all of you, my guess is that you have different favorite songs, but that you would use similar language to describe the experience of your favorite song. And so when we think about making something simple or intuitive for different sorts of audiences, I think about that sort of that experience of your favorite song and how it's going to be different person to person, but there's this universality of feeling. When we think about patterns and how they change by target audiences, there's also this notion that, like, when you're a kid, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is the most interesting and fascinating pattern, and you love it, and you listen to it over and over and over again. But as you grow up, it becomes too simple, it gets boring, it's not compelling. And so other types of users or other people really like jazz, like they love how it won't resolve, and other people need a certain sort of chord progression. And that stuff is just fascinating to me, and I want to find a way to apply it to user experience, which I will, trust me. But first, I also want to talk about narratives and how are there patterns of stories and narratives as well. And Kurt Vonnegut actually charted some of the more famous and common stories. So this is Cinderella, and it's pretty easy, I think. I have actually a laser pointer. So the beginning is probably fairy godmother, and then shit, it's midnight, and then, oh no, wait, the shoe fits. These are archetypal patterns. These are stories that we hear again and again in different forms. Also this one, man falls in a well. Things are really, really bad, and then they start to get better. We know these so well, we can pick them out in so many different formats. We just recognize them. They're just inherent to something about our consciousness. It's just able to adapt and understand things. This one's a little bit of an inside joke for English majors. But basically it's the story of you wake up and everything is hopeless. So what does this mean for user experience? I think this is actually a really interesting graph when we think about the assumptions and the guesses that people are going to make at different parts. So for example, if we think about Cinderella, we can also think about Gmail's innovation of did you forget to attach that? So they'll read in an email that you said that you used the word attachment and that you didn't attach anything, and they want to save you from yourself. And I think that this is a similar story of tension, anxiety, and then relief, because somebody, some Google fairy godmother has your back, and I think that's awesome. Man falls in a well is kind of a story about insight search, in terms of like, this is not bad, okay, I found a way out. And Kafka, of course, is not responsive design. So I want to think about the ways that assumptions and content interact to create an experience, and also ultimately what we can learn from these sorts of interactions to apply to user experience design, specifically around this notion of assumptions. And I think movie trailers are incredible for what they're able to do in the amount of time that they have. They give you a sense of what you can expect in an hour and a half to 2 hours in the course of 45 seconds. All of these patterns, like movies should be multiple and there should be a ton of them, but they actually fall down as like pretty straightforward and easy genres. So for example, you can build them now yourself, which I think is a very interesting tool. So you can take footage from your family vacation to a national park service and turn it into like a superhero film. And it's all totally done. Like they know how you can signify the sorts of stories and just plug in all of the correct shots and all of like just the right way to set it up in a useful way. And suddenly it's rendered as a separate genre. So what does this ultimately mean for user experience research and design? So if across different formats, whether it's music or stories or trailers, there's this pattern of constantly trying to reevaluate and make new estimations. And the degree to which those guesses or those estimations are correct has to do with user experience. So I'm pretty sure that if we want to make something intuitive, we have to figure out the story that the user is telling themselves and then have a website that matches it. This Copeland quote is about how we're compelled to make stories, and if we can't take the events of our life and make a coherent story, we feel lost. And as much as storytelling is indeed a cliche, I think that quote is so helpful because it shifts the paradigm from the story that your really gorgeous parallax scroll, infinite, etc., full bleed image with text overlay, like that is not the story. The story that we need to care about is the one that the user is telling themselves when they arrive on that page. So then I want to think about, how do we figure out what that story is? Like, what are those assumptions across the board? How can we figure out their instincts and meet them there? Think of the relief that comes from like knowing that something is going to be where you think it is, and that just sort of involves like guessing where somebody is going to jump. And so that's kind of what our job is. If we want something to be simple and intuitive, we have to make our users right as often as possible. And that's tricky, but not impossible. A really important tool for this is a persona. And I think user research and user-centered design can feel a little bit overwhelming. It can feel like all of your users are essentially sheep. But if you use personas, and there are a lot of different ways, you can research your target audience in terms of surveys, what are the most important questions that you need to know, you can get at observations, interviews, and then capture them in the form of a fictional person. And there are many brilliant blog posts about the correct formats and all of that, but I really just want to talk about sort of the rationale behind them and what they allow you to do in terms of making it easier to predict what's going to be most useful for your user. So you want to use this research and surveys and interviews and observations, and you want to get to know them as well as you can. You want to identify who they are as individual sheep, as people, and then make that into some sort of fictional person that you capture their demographics and their goals, what are their frustrations, what are their interim solutions. So how are they already solving whatever problem it is that you are also offering a solution to? And as much as you can find out about them, the more that you can predict what they're going to want or need or where they're going to go, and you can help understand what information will be most relevant to them and will resonate with them. And you can go from a flock of sheep to actually a very recognizable individual and somebody that you can understand almost and work with them, and you can make them the main character of whatever story that it is. So before personas, you define your target audience and then you design with them in mind. And to talk a little bit about how we've found this to be most helpful in the development process is if you have a character, and it can feel tricky, I know, to like make a fictional person and have this fictional person be the stand-in for an actual user, but it helps everybody to have like somebody that they quote unquote met, like either a client or a developer. You create this shared reality that you then all buy into, and if it's based in research, it's actually not that imaginary at all. It's also very helpful while you're doing this to define an anti-persona, because that is the person for whom your solution is not appropriate. And when you're making a decision in terms of color or label or layout, or you're trying to figure out what to prioritize for the next release, if you know who your user is, and also specifically or as specifically who they're not, it's just easier to predict and it's easier to provide a useful solution. And I think one of the best examples of persona work, and also the UX mafia will not let me present a presentation without using this example, is MailChimp's style guide. So this is an internal style guide in which they've associated different types of content with what the user is feeling. And at the start they have a success message, and at the end they have a failure message, and it's just, it ties the user's emotions to the voice that we should correspond to. So in terms of a failure message, it's kind of small, you should definitely check it out, but it says, don't joke around with people who are frustrated, essentially. And that's so important, that's taking that persona and understanding what they're going to need in a certain type of context or a certain situation. And by breaking this down in terms of content types and also emotions, you can make sure that you are providing something that's going to resonate, and it's going to help them communicate. It helps you understand like what do people need to hear, and it gives you guidance as to how to communicate that. Another tool is card sorts. So a level above tone and voice is navigation. And one of the tasks that your users are going to face time and again is trying to find something, like some sort of article or some kind of card content. And card sorts are really going to help you understand how they categorize things intuitively. You can essentially define information types, and then you ask users to sort them. And this think out loud piece is amazing, because that's how you figure out how they're making those decisions, especially if you have, my favorite is to have like a couple fighting over where a piece of information belongs. Like, no, it belongs in this category, and no, in that category, and you can see the story that they're telling themselves about how your content is organized. And that story is the one that you really need to uncover, because when they're going to the site without you, they're going to be making their best guess, and they're going to be doing what's natural and instinctive, and you need to match that if you're going to create something that's intuitive, or something that's useful, or something that's just not terrible to use. We've also used this in terms of navigation and categorization. You can also use it for prioritization. So we worked on one project, and it turns out that it's a decision-making process that ultimately spans several different segments of time. So there's a part where you need to make a decision, and then there's a part where you need to plan. And we asked users to take different pieces of information and tell us at what stage would this be most useful to you. And you can see what answers they're going to need at different stages. And that's phenomenally useful because it shows that you understand what they're trying to do and you're supporting it. You can set up a relevant navigational structure, which is again going to help with like, where do people naturally go to find your content? If you put it there, then that's an intuitive navigational decision. You can do this remotely using optimal sort. We've had luck with this. This is an example that we used in class, and then I sped it up, so I think it looks pretty cool. But you can see that you take the content types from the left and then categorize them, and then eventually label those different categories. And then you can see which pieces of information, either if it's an open card sort, that means that you label the categories themselves, the user does, or if it's closed, that means that the categories are already labeled and you just need to fit them into those boxes. But you can see when two people or two different groups will put the same type of information in the same category or different categories. We've used this sort of research in the past to decide like what are the most helpful ways to filter through a lot of content. Do people want to do it by date or author? What's most useful and intuitive for them when they're like have a big pile of content and need to get to the thing that they're actually looking for? What are the most useful ways to route through that? So on top of voice and tone and then navigation, it's ultimately about getting something done. You're using a site for its functionality. And so we need to find ways to make that as easy as possible. So the first step in a screen observation is to define a task. So what is it most important for your users to accomplish on your site? This is going to be informed by a lot of things. Business priorities, competitive opportunities, what your passion is, etc. But if you've defined what the user needs to be able to do on the site as quickly as possible, then you've established some sort of motivation. So you know that they really want to be able to get this done, and then your job as a designer is to make a system that does that as easy as possible. And the screen observation is sort of where all of that comes together. It's sort of like the final exam. You can do it with a prototype, you can do it with an existing site, paper, anything, but it's when you validate that what you have found to be natural is also what the user is going to find like easy, essentially. So we recently did some work for the Field Museum, and we knew that one of the most important tasks on the website, understandably, is to find something that you're excited to see in person. Like this is pretty much what the website should do more than anything, is to get you excited to visit the actual museum. And so we wanted to find out ways that we could improve the current site. And so we gave users the task of finding information about an exhibit that they would be excited to see in person. And we told them it's not a test of you, it's a test of the system. And we had also interviewed them beforehand. Also, they were on site at the Field Museum, it's important to mention. So we had validated that motivation that way. Like they had come here, they were clearly excited about something. So we wanted to see what that behavior looked on the site, because that space in between, knowing that somebody's really excited about something, but that they're having trouble on the site, if you need to get those two as close together as possible if you're going to do your job as a user experience designer. It might be tricky, but you can see navigating around, one of the things that we observed over time was there's confusion between plan your visit and happening at the field. There's no real default location for a lot of this content. World's Fair was something in a lot of interviews that people were excited to see, but for whatever reason, they're not interacting with this. They don't see this as something that they can engage with, or it's not something that they're really excited to engage with. you get the idea. This is a screen recording from the current site. It just launched a couple of weeks ago. We haven't done any user testing, but I can just show you how we incorporated what we learned from the screen observations into the new design. So exhibition and events is a very clear destination if you want to find information about what you can see. Similarly, it's easier, there's more of an interaction between these blocks. If you're looking for, the goal hopefully, is that if you're looking for something that you want to see, this design and this interaction is making it easier for you to accomplish that task. If you think it might be cool to visit the museum, we want the website to confirm that, like to show you that you're right. So I think that these represent two possible user experiences. So somebody comes to a new site and they could feel one of two things. Like either this is going to be terrible and scary and creaky and foggy, or it's going to be awesome in California and by the beach. And so what can we do like to make it more California and less scary, Sleepy Hollow? So I think of meaningless jargon, mean error messages, and useless functionality as things that really detract from user experience. So if we think about the story that the user is telling themselves, like, how can we show them that they found the right thing? These are like just taking their instincts and their ambitions and just not supporting it. Basically saying that the site is not for them and that they've come to the wrong place. On the other hand, useful functionality, relevant copy that speaks to them, and a functionality which has the ability to anticipate the user. So things like frequently asked questions, autocomplete, elements that know what the user is trying to accomplish. It's like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Let me help you with that. So I think we can revisit these graphs in a way that's pretty useful in terms of thinking about user experience and stories. So I'd say that this is frustrating. But then the terms that I think of associated with this are essentially, this is too confusing, this was a mistake, and I've moved on. It's important to keep in mind that on the internet, your competitor is one tab away. I mean, I don't want to knock those interested in home improvement, but if you go to Home Depot and you get really terrible service, your threshold for accepting that is much higher because you've made the trip, you have to get this done. But if you're on a website and it's not working the way you want it to, like, then you will check out. More optimistically, we can think about what is intuitive UX. And it might be hyperbole to think in terms of like, I am a genius, but I don't know about you, but I was incredibly proud of myself for having solved like example problems in my middle school algebra textbook, right? Like, solving any kind of problem makes us feel proud, and it should. So I think the best thing that we can do when it comes to user experience is give the user this notion of like, I figured it out, I'm so smart. And that could mean a lot of different things. It could be like, I am so smart for having gotten this done in a fifth of the time so that I can now go back and watch Netflix. Or I am so smart for saving myself so much money because I was able to set up this fascinating RSS feed. Whatever it is, I think intuitive ultimately means empowering. And that ultimately involves anticipating your users and knowing what they're going to want. So I think about the future, and I think about where we can go. And this generally seems like the time in the talk when we have to sum it up and look towards the future. I'm really interested in sort of how this intuition will affect how different devices are used. When you're doing a task halfway on your laptop and then on your phone, what does that mean for user experience? And how can we continue to create experiences and tools that better reflect how people are actually living their lives? Additionally, when we give users more control to customize functionality or appearance, that is infinitely more useful but also infinitely more complex. For now though, I'm lucky to work for a client services agency, which means I get to work with different target audiences and different stories all the time, helping them to be proven right time and again. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I do. Hi, my name is Steve, and I work as a software task consultant. And I
Sure. So the question is, at what point does the designer become, at what point does a designer become overly familiar with their product such that they can't test their assumptions? And I would say definitely getting as much outside input is great. Target audience is fantastic. One interim solution that we found is if you are working across teams, just having people that aren't familiar with the project themselves, they might not be a member of your target audience, but they aren't aware of like all the thinking and the rationale that went behind it. And then ultimately, best case solution scenarios that you're tracking your assumptions throughout the process. You're like, it's going to be really expensive if we get this wrong. So then you're able to flag those things, and that's what you want to test with real users.
Can you tell me the role of heuristics, heuristic analysis, in making sure that we're developing experiences that are empathetic to users?
Sure. So heuristics are best practices that were developed by Jacob Nielsen, and they involve things. I forget like the actual specific terms, but in terms of recognition instead of recall, best practices essentially. And what you can do often in projects, especially if you're looking at an existing site that you want to redesign, is you measure them against these heuristics, and they're best practices for usability and user experience, and they're very useful. I would say that they're probably 80% of the way there, and just in terms of, this is perhaps ungenerous, but I think of it as sort of like a smog check for your vehicle.
So doing a lot of user research for a project is kind of ideal, but the reality is a lot of times we're working on projects that are kind of small time frame, small budget. Are there like a couple easy things that you can suggest doing just to help take a step towards finding the best result for your user experience?
Yeah, it's an ongoing strategic question for sure. I guess it depends if you're working on a redesign or if you're working on a new site, and then also if you have access to users, because that can take a lot of time. I would say the farther along in a project you are, the more expensive it is to incorporate design, just because it's farther along and higher fidelity at that point. So you can do paper prototyping. Steve Krug has a really great book called Rocket Science Made Easy. Rocket Surgery Made Easy. It's a counterintuitive title. And that's all about guerrilla usability testing and using paper prototypes to validate your assumptions throughout the process.
Okay.
I would also, I find personas increasingly helpful, to be honest, to just sort of get everybody aligned on who your user is and what their motivations are. It can feel tricky at the outset of the process, but being able to have some sort of principle that you can circle back to is very, very useful.
Thank you.
I loved your presentation. It was really great. Question I have is, a lot of times, particularly with small business owners, they have descriptions that they want to put on a website. Can you comment a little bit about how do you think that now with mobile and with tablets and particularly now with websites, you got big fonts pretty much all over the place, how much that has changed in terms of what can be communicated about your product and service?
So I think copy within the context of responsive design is super fascinating. I think one of the important things to keep in mind is context, essentially. So what is it most important for your users to know on a small screen, generally on the go, when they're trying to look up something in situations where they might be looking for directions or in the store? So basically the underlying assumption there is that they're going to have different needs on a small screen as opposed to a large screen. So if you can help the client or the small business owner understand what is it most important for people to know in different situations, and then you can have the design adjust accordingly.
Thank you.
So if you are starting out with like a new user, you really don't know too much about the new users. It's great to develop personas, and I've definitely done that before, but what do you do when you don't have enough data to say here are the personas, you just, draft up what you assume they may be and kind of go off of that, or what do you recommend that you do in that situation to kind of guide your project?
Do you have access to users that you can interview, or are you saying in the absence of that?
In the absence of that.
Sure. Personas are, and it also depends, I guess, the makeup of your team. They were not ideal in that situation, but it's also possible that you can just say, this is the things that we're very thin ice, or if you have market research that you can leverage, or look at competitors to get a sense of who you ultimately want this to be sketching that out is also helpful, along with defining who your users aren't going to be. I guess the goal is to have a criteria that you can use over the course of the project to say, like, yes, this falls within our target audience's motivations and frustrations, or it doesn't.
Don't we have a product